So, Nick, we got to break down the incredible performance of Renato Moicano in his Dr. Stoppage victory over Benoît Saint-Denis. There were a lot of really good things that I saw out of Moicano in that first round. And really, first round against BSD was probably the best that we've seen Moicano look thus far.
For sure.
Everything looked really sharp. The initial reaction that I had when I saw the exchanges on the feet prior to the takedown was that Moicano had a massive speed advantage, and he was landing a lot of good shots. The takedown was obviously perfectly timed and beautiful. And then the transitions, we knew he has great jiu-jitsu, obviously over 10 wins in the UFC by submission. But BSD is also known as a jiu-jitsu ace.
Right.
So I kind of was thinking before the fight that those two's jiu-jitsu would essentially cancel each other out, and the fight would largely take place on the feet. But it certainly seemed like Moicano was levels ahead of BSD when it came to the transitions, to the control, to how he progressed the movements in order to get to those really devastating ground and pound positions. And ultimately, it was the damage he did in the first round that kind of festered and built and swole BSD's eye in that second 5 minutes. That was what ultimately got him the stoppage. Right. So really and truly, he put the work in the first round. And then I want to talk a little bit too about that shoulder, because we saw his shoulder was completely out of place, which you saw him kind of keep his power hand at bay the second round, which makes total sense. So thankfully for him, he put enough in the first to get the job done.
Yeah, that was about as good of a round as you could possibly have in the UFC. Moicano looked amazing on the feet. The speed was really, really noticeable, and he was cutting good angles. He was getting just out of range and landing his counter shots. Everything looked really good, and I loved that takedown because what it was a full display of mixing the martial arts. He had he kicked it, caught a kick, which is kind of like a Muay Thai technique, and turned it straight into an arm drag or a leg drag to the back, and then he took it down to the ground, which is truly mixing the martial arts. And then, of course, he had the leg entanglement right after that to make sure he could keep top position. And then once he got to the ground, he was all about keeping top position and top pressure, and he did a great job at that. He threw a fair amount of strikes early on when he was trying to get the top positions that he wanted, and then once he found himself in mount and body triangle, he was able to find some of those amazing, devastating elbows and then some great ground and pound that really was the reason that the fight got stopped, because when you get into the second round, his shoulder was noticeably like out of socket. I don't know exactly what happened, but it was not good, and it took till like almost 2 minutes left in the round for him to even throw that punch once, and you can tell it felt very awkward for him. So I did have the second round going towards BSD, largely because of his boxing, the way he was able to control the pace better, and obviously the fact that Moicano wasn't throwing hardly any volume or anything other than a jab. That allowed BSD to open up his offense a little bit more. And the other thing that looked good in the second round for BSD was the takedown defense, because Moicano wanted to get the fight to the ground, obviously because of the shoulder injury, but BSD was better with his feet, better with his balance, and better with his boxing to avoid getting taken down and having the guy who's injured wanting the fight to take place on the ground on top of you, eating up minutes on the clock. So yeah, I thought the fight was interesting. I really would love to have seen them go all 5 rounds or get some more out of it, but the round Moicano put in the first round is more than enough to earn yourself a victory against a top guy like BSD.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And I think it was the right call, too, because, obviously you heard the resounding boos. BSD is the French fighter. But listen, this fight took place in France, and it was a French doctor that called the fight. So there was nothing nefarious there whatsoever. And I think it was the right call, because in the beginning, you saw the doctor come in and he was doing, he was throwing up numbers with his fingers and asking BSD to call out the numbers. Now, I don't speak French, but I think BSD was getting the numbers right when he was able to look with both eyes. When the doctor covered one of the eyes, he was not able to get them as quickly, and I don't think he got all of them correct as the doctor was holding them up. And the doctor very clearly said to Mark Goddard, he can't see out of his right eye.
Right.
One thing we know, I don't care if it's the hometown guy. I don't care if it's who everybody bought tickets to come and see. We have to play the rules fair as they are. We can discuss whether or not a rule should be, but if it's in the rule book, we have to go by it, regardless of who the fighter is. And in this scenario, it was the right call. It's very clearly stated in the mixed martial arts rules that if you cannot see out of an eye, you cannot continue.
Yeah, that's as clear of a fight ender as they have.
Exactly. And so ultimately a TKO doctor's stoppage is what we ended up getting. And thankfully for Renato Moicano, or if you're a Renato fan, he did what he had to do in that first round, because who knows where things would have gone. I, like you, did see the second round going in favor of Benoît Saint-Denis, but I just want to note too that it's very impressive that Moicano made that round even competitive, only using a jab and a few inside leg kicks. When he tried to throw that backhand, it was literally at half of the speed that it was in the first round. So there's no way, even if he fights through the pain, to throw that hand. And I was watching an interview with Moicano where he said that injury was even prior to the fight. Almost think of like TJ Dillashaw back in the day when his arm was just hanging limp. He knew he had that injury, but he wasn't going to pull out of a main event, especially a big opportunity like that. But obviously, differently than Dillashaw, Moicano did get the W. Speaks to how tough he is. Moicano's a really tough guy. And I think, shoulder injury aside, just looking at the first 5 minutes, we're in for some really exciting fights from Moicano from here on out, because that was as good as he's ever looked. Called out Paddy Pimblett. Called out, I said Pimblett because he said that. Called out Paddy Pimblett, called out Dan Hooker. Both fun fights. Renato, prior to, let's say 9 months ago, a year ago, I would have said that he's not going to get the Paddy fight because Paddy's got the stardom. Renato, it was not where Paddy is.
Right.
And Renato was always a very dangerous fight for Paddy. But as of late, Renato's got his podcast. Yeah. He's great. He's absolute money, like his nickname, on the microphone after a fight. And he's kind of become a big star. So you're not really risking anything putting him in there with Paddy, because both of them are stars at this point, and both of them are guys that the UFC sees a bright future for. Obviously, Renato's a little older than Paddy, so it'll probably be shorter lived. But it's the right call, because when you're number 11 and you beat number 12, the way he beat him, you're probably going to jump up a few points in the ranking. It doesn't make sense to call out Islam and the people at the top of the heap, because there's just so much going on at 155 right now with Arman, with Islam, with Charles Oliveira now taking on Michael Chandler. Who knows what's going to happen with that?
Right.
That it makes sense for Renato to continue to build his stardom. He calls them easy fights. Paddy Pimblett, regardless of what you think of the guy, is not an easy fight. He showed us that he's a very, very, very skilled fighter. Dan Hooker, tattooed Dan, looks as good as anybody right now, beating Mateusz Gamrot. I mean, that's no slouch to defeat. So either one of those would not be easy fights, but I think they would both be really, really fun. Actually, I think Hooker versus Moicano stylistically might even be more fun than Paddy, but both of them signed me up for him.
Yeah, that would be a lot of fun. And I think Hooker he's my front runner for the Conor McGregor fight. I think Conor's going to fight next year and Hooker's going to wait around for that, but he can't wait too long and do the same thing that Michael Chandler just did. So I would love to see Dan Hooker, but if we don't hear about that one soon, then I would start to lean more towards Paddy happening. And I think boxing and the UFC are similar in a lot of ways, but boxing really does have one formula. You get a guy, you get him a squeaky clean record all the way up into a legitimate 30-0 or whatever like that, and then you start to put him in some title fights, and that's just the formula that works in boxing. Occasionally it works for pay-per-views, and they can have a real star that can get behind. The UFC is a little different. They will bring somebody in that they think has star potential, and they won't like throw him right to the wolves immediately. They'll bring him up a little bit, certainly not like a 20-fight thing like in boxing. It's about 5 fights that you get a little bit of grace on if you're lucky, and even still those turn out to not be such easy fights, but that's just the what everybody seems to think these days. But with the UFC these days, you've got 2 stars emerging in one division, like Paddy and now Renato Moicano, and eventually you can just take one of them and utilize the other one's hype with the other ones, and now you've got a even stronger force coming in to the division. They're ranked perfectly for that to happen. Whichever one of them gets it really does kind of emerge into that like number 7 or 8 spot and starts to talk to the people down there in the top 5. And I think that's exactly what Moicano is capable of doing next, and I would like to see that. And I think Paddy the Baddy is only primed to be fighting legitimate legit ranked guys now that people know, because he is a household name and people are really starting to take to Patty and they want to see how far he can go in the division. So I think that's the right fight to do. But of course, I would not be mad if they made the Hooker fight.
Yeah, me either. Next for Benoît Saint-Denis, because this is an interesting one. You know, BSD before the Poirier fight was a guy that we all thought was on the fast track to a title fight. We thought that, you know, the guy's 27, 28 years old.
Beast.
Really good submissions, awesome power in his hands, has everything that is needed for a star and a champion. Now he's probably going to be looking at like the edge of the top 15, maybe even out of the top 15. He was number 12 coming in. I expect him to land 14, 15.
Yeah.
I do still think he'll have a number next to his name. But what do you do with him, and what did he really do wrong that you would say he could improve on? Because, you know, he did look decent in the second round. Obviously, when an eye swells up, it swells up. You can't see. You got to call the fight.
Right.
But, you know, BSD, I think, still being in his late 20s, is going to be somebody that's still a formidable force going forward. I think he's still going to get back in the win column and string a few together, and then we'll see some fun things happen for him. But tough break, because that's 2 losses in a row now, both of them by finish. So that's a hard thing. Do you have a name? I don't necessarily have a name that I would say I'd love to see BSD. Maybe you guys have a name. To drop it in the chat below, drop it in the comments. But what would you like to see next for Benoît Saint-Denis?
Yeah, it's hard to say. And one thing about him is he's as tough as an old leather boot, because that first round was exhausting for him. It was exhausting for Moicano, and he was on the fun side of it. BSD really took a beating there. And, you know, he looked good, came in strong in the second round, and he couldn't do enough. And I think it's because he was exhausted from the first round. If he didn't lose so much energy in that first round and get beat up so bad in the first round, I think he could have actually come a lot stronger at Moicano and injured Moicano, who couldn't throw one of his most important weapons, which was his backhand. But, you know, it was just one of those things where he got beat up so bad in the first round that it just it took too much time and too much effort for him to get himself back into the fight. So I don't really know. And 155 is an interesting division because things can change very rapidly up there. And then some people are very active. Some people are kind of inactive, and you don't know exactly where they're going next. But off the top of my head, rankings wise, similar numbers, maybe like a Jalen Turner or something. Yeah, I don't know. There's something that
was kind of what I was thinking. Jalen Turner might be a good one. Rafael Fiziev, I know he's probably a little bit higher up.
But he hasn't fought that much recently.
And Benoit, like, quite frankly, he's going to need to take some time off, because that eye is not going to heal fully to where he can spar again for several months.
No, and the Poirier thing was no easy thing either.
That was a, you know, a different type of finish, and he absorbed a lot of trauma with that finish. So Benoît Saint-Denis, I think, needs to take some time, recuperate himself fully.
I agree.
Take 3 months and heal up, get back in the gym, come out strong, feasibly look for somebody in the top 10 to 15 and get himself back in the win column. And, you know, if he can do that and string 2 more together, then he's righted the ship and is still on the right side of 30 years old. He still has a bright future ahead of him. But all in all, congratulations to Renato Moicano. Beautiful performance, beautiful display.
Absolutely.
And I want to say one more thing before we wrap, too, because a lot of fighters lately, Merab Dvalishvili, this has been on my mind because of the Sean O'Malley victory that he just had, say that grappling is boring in MMA. And I'll give it to you that grappling, if you're just laying and kind of holding a fighter down and doing only what's necessary to keep the fight from being stood back up, is boring.
Right.
However, when you're a submission hunter, when you're just dropping just devastating elbows on your opponent like Renato was, when you're landing big shots, when you're transitioning well, when you're looking to advance position at all costs, to me, that is not boring at all. It's a very integral part of what mixed martial arts is.
Yeah.
And I think we all need to appreciate the beautiful groundwork of Moicano.
Yeah, there's definitely boring ground fighting. There's boring stand-up as well, just the same. But yeah, once you start to realize there's finite detail in every little aspect of the game, especially on the ground. When you start to see people do things on the ground and can control another human being, it's very fun to watch. And once you start to learn it, you appreciate it a little bit more. But yeah, all in all, great fights. And I think that if people start, if you watch the Moicano fight and you were bored by it, maybe fighting isn't the sport for you.
Yeah.
But either way you put it, I think that kind of performance is the type of performance that'll bring more fans to the sport. And yeah, hats off to him.